You're always reacting to what happens instead of being in control of what happens. Every problem catches you by surprise. Every fight leaves you scrambling. And you watch others handle the same stuff like they always know what's coming next. I am Sun Tzu, the old war leader who learned how to control any situation on the battlefield, where losing control meant death. What I learned about taking control will change how you handle any problem life throws at you, so you can shape what happens instead of just reacting to it. The same tricks that helped me win battles before they started can help you master any situation today. But first, like this video, subscribe for more old wisdom made simple, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which part of the world is ready to take control. I still remember my first real battle like it happened yesterday, though decades have passed since that morning when everything I thought I knew about war proved useless. I was young, maybe 25, full of confidence from years of studying ancient military texts and training with wooden swords until my hands were covered in I had memorized every formation, every strategy, every principle of warfare that the great masters had written down. But when I saw the enemy charging toward us across that muddy field, screaming their war cries and waving their weapons like wild animals, something happened that no text had prepared me for. My mind went completely blank. All those carefully memorized strategies disappeared like morning mist. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. My hands shook so violently I could barely grip my sword. The enemy was supposed to attack from the east at dawn, according to our scouts. That's what all our preparations had assumed. Our archers were positioned on the eastern ridge. Our cavalry was stationed to counter an eastern assault, and our infantry was arranged to defend against an eastern charge. But the enemy didn't read our plans. They came from 3 directions at once, north, south, and west, while sending only a small diversionary force from the east. In moments, everything we had prepared for became irrelevant. My carefully positioned archers found themselves shooting at empty ground while real enemies approached from behind. My cavalry was perfectly positioned to counter an attack that never came, while actual threats overwhelmed our flanks. My infantry formations, designed for eastern defense, created gaps that western attackers could exploit. And there I stood in the middle of this chaos, watching my perfect plan collapse like a house built on sand, while 300 soldiers looked to me for orders I couldn't give because I was still trying to understand what was actually happening versus what was supposed to be happening. That's when my mentor, General Wu, appeared beside me. He was calm in a way that seemed impossible given the circumstances. He didn't shout orders or take over command. He didn't criticize my failed preparations or point out my obvious mistakes. Instead, he stood next to me quietly for a moment, watching the battle develop, then asked a simple question that changed everything. What do you see now that you didn't see before? I forced myself to stop panicking about what had gone wrong and start observing what was actually happening. Yes, the enemy had surprised us with their approach, but now that they were committed to attacking from 3 sides, I could see things that hadn't been visible when I was focused on my original plan. Their forces were spread much thinner than ours, because they had divided to attack from multiple directions. They had exhausted themselves running uphill to reach our position, while our troops were rested and defending familiar ground. Most importantly, their 3-pronged attack had created a gap in their center. They were strong on our flanks, but weak in the middle where their coordination was poorest. I see opportunity, I told General Wu, and for the first time that morning, I meant it. Good, he replied. Now what will you do about it? That question forced me to stop being a victim of circumstances and start being a strategist again. Instead of trying to salvage my original plan, I created a completely new one based on the actual situation in front of me. I pulled our center forward to exploit the gap in their formation while using our flank units to hold their scattered attacks in place. Within an hour, We had turned their tactical advantage into a strategic disaster for them. We won that battle decisively, but not because everything went according to plan. We won because we adapted to reality instead of fighting it. That day taught me the most fundamental lesson about control. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can always control how you respond to what happens to you. After I learned to control my own reactions, I had to master the art of reading everything and everyone around me. You cannot control a situation if you don't understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Most people walk into rooms completely blind to the undercurrents of power, emotion, and intention that determine outcomes before a single word is spoken. I learned this lesson through painful experience during what should have been a routine peace negotiation. 3 enemy lords had requested a meeting to discuss ending a border conflict that had been bleeding all our territories dry for months. On the surface, everything seemed straightforward. They wanted peace, we wanted peace, and the terms they proposed seemed reasonable enough. But something felt wrong from the moment I entered their tent. I had brought my divination coins with me, not because I believed in supernatural guidance, but because the ritual of rolling them in my palm forced me to slow down and observe details I might otherwise miss. As I sat there quietly manipulating the coins under the table, I watched the 3 lords much more carefully than I listened to their words. The first lord agreed to everything we proposed too quickly. Most people would have seen this as positive cooperation, but I noticed that his eyes never stayed focused on any one person for more than a few seconds. He kept glancing toward the tent entrance as if expecting someone, or as if planning an escape route. His hands fidgeted constantly with his weapons, and his voice had the slightly higher pitch that comes from nervousness or deception. The second lord was equally revealing, but in a different way. He rarely spoke first on any topic. Instead, he would wait for the third lord to offer an opinion, then expand on it or agree with it. When I asked him direct questions, he would pause and look at the third lord before answering. He wasn't making independent decisions, he was taking orders from someone he considered his superior, even though all 3 were supposed to be negotiating as equals. But the third lord was the most interesting of all. He spoke the least, sat slightly apart from the others, and maintained the kind of relaxed posture that comes from genuine confidence rather than performed authority. When he did speak, both other lords immediately paid attention and adjusted their positions accordingly. He never looked nervous, never seemed eager to please, and never showed any of the tells that indicate deception or uncertainty. That's when I understood the real power structure in the room. The first lord was nervous because he was planning something treacherous and knew the risks involved. The second lord was deferential because he was following orders from someone else. The third lord was calm because he was the one actually making decisions while letting the others play their assigned roles. This observation taught me 5 critical signs that reveal who really holds power in any situation, regardless of titles or formal authority. First, watch who enters the room. Last, people with real power make others wait for them, rather than arriving early to please others. Second, observe where everyone positions themselves in relation to each other. People naturally sit or stand closer to those they respect or fear. Third, notice who speaks first. When there's an uncomfortable silence, anxious people rush to fill silence, while confident people use it strategically. Fourth, pay attention to whose ideas get built upon versus whose ideas get politely ignored. Shows real influence more clearly than formal agreements. Fifth, observe who people look at when they laugh or when difficult questions are asked. We instinctively seek approval or guidance from those whose opinions matter most to us. Armed with this understanding, I completely changed my negotiation strategy. Instead of treating all 3 lords as equal partners, I addressed my most important points directly to the third lord, while acknowledging his real authority. I offered him more respect and better terms than the other two, recognizing that he was the actual decision-maker, regardless of the diplomatic fiction that they were all equals. The negotiation succeeded, because I dealt with reality rather than appearances, but it also revealed that the Third Lord was indeed planning to betray any agreement we reached. Not because of anything he said, his words were perfectly diplomatic, but because of how the others acted around him. They showed fear rather than respect, tension rather than trust. Their body language told me that they expected violence regardless of what papers we signed. This intelligence allowed me to prepare for the betrayal that came 3 weeks later, turning their planned surprise attack into a devastating defeat for their forces. Most people lose control of situations before the situations even begin because they show up unprepared, stand in the wrong place, and react to circumstances instead of shaping them. I learned early that position determines outcome more than skill, more than courage, more than good intentions combined. My collection of strategic battle maps taught me everything I needed to know about the power of positioning. Before any significant conflict, I would spend days studying not just the immediate terrain, but the broader context that would determine where advantages lay. Where was the high ground that would give archers better range and cavalry better momentum? Where were the escape routes that would allow strategic withdrawal if needed? Where would the enemy expect me to position my forces? And where would they never think to look? I learned that battles are often decided before the first arrow is shot, simply by who chooses better ground and positions their resources more wisely. This principle became dramatically clear during a campaign where I was outnumbered 3-1 by an enemy force that had superior equipment and more experienced soldiers. Any direct confrontation would have been suicide for my army, but instead of accepting defeat or retreating immediately, I spent 2 weeks studying the valley where the enemy was encamped, looking for positional advantages that could overcome their numerical superiority. I discovered that every morning they sent scouts up the eastern ridge to watch for my approach from the main road. Their entire defensive strategy assumed I would either attempt a direct assault through the southern pass where the terrain favored defenders, or perhaps try a night attack from the western slopes where previous commanders had failed. Instead, I positioned my forces on the northern cliff's difficult terrain that required 2 extra days of hard climbing to reach, but it placed us above their camp with the morning sun at our backs. When we attacked at dawn, they were temporarily blinded by sunlight and completely confused about our numbers and positions. From their perspective below, we appeared much larger and more threatening than we actually were, because the sun created silhouettes that distorted our actual size. They couldn't count our forces accurately, couldn't determine our precise positions, and couldn't coordinate an effective response because they were looking directly into the rising sun. They surrendered within hours, never realizing that the overwhelming force attacking them from an impregnable position was actually a smaller, desperate army that had simply chosen superior ground for the confrontation. That victory taught me that there are 3 fundamental positions you can take in any conflict: superior, equal, or inferior. Superior position means you have significant advantages that make success highly likely: better resources, better timing, better information, or better terrain. Equal position means you're evenly matched with your opponent, and success depends primarily on execution and adaptability. Inferior position means you're at a serious disadvantage and need to either improve your position or change the nature of the conflict entirely. Most people passively accept whatever position they find themselves in, then wonder why their efforts don't produce the results they want. They show up to important negotiations in the other person's office, on the other person's schedule, discussing the other person's preferred agenda. They go to job interviews without researching the company's current challenges, without preparing thoughtful questions that demonstrate their value. and without understanding what the employer really needs beyond the job description. Smart positioning requires thinking several moves ahead and begins long before the actual conflict or negotiation takes place. When I was working to gain influence at the royal court, I didn't wait for formal audiences to make my case to the king. Instead, I learned his daily routines and positioned myself where he naturally spent time. I discovered that he took solitary walks in the palace gardens every morning to think through the day's decisions. I learned which path he preferred and began taking my own walks at the same time, not to intrude on his privacy, but to be naturally present when he wanted to discuss ideas with someone he trusted. I found out that he often visited the royal stables in the evening because he found the horses calming after difficult days of politics and administration. I made sure to develop genuine relationships with the stable masters and horse trainers, so my presence there felt natural rather than calculated. Most importantly, I made myself useful before I needed anything from him, offering solutions to problems he was already facing rather than asking for favors or opportunities. I learned the true power of silence from watching my teacher pour tea until the cup overflowed, then asking me what I observed. "The cup is too full to receive more tea," I replied, thinking I was stating the obvious. "Exactly," he said, with a knowing smile. "And a conversation too full of your words cannot receive important information from others. The empty cup has infinite potential. It can hold whatever is poured into it. The full cup can hold nothing." That lesson saved my career and possibly my life during negotiations with Lord Zhang, a rival warlord known throughout the region for his explosive temper and his need to dominate every conversation. His reputation was fearsome. Grown men trembled when he raised his voice. Experienced diplomats stumbled over their words when he interrupted them, and even other warlords avoided direct confrontation with him because few people could match his verbal aggression. Everyone who had dealt with Zhang before tried to meet his intensity with equal force. They spoke louder when he shouted, interrupted him when he interrupted them, and attempted to claim conversational territory through sheer volume and persistence. Every single one of them failed to achieve their objectives, leaving his presence. Feeling defeated and diminished, I decided to try the opposite approach entirely. When we met in his fortress, I greeted him with respectful formality, stated my position clearly in exactly 2 sentences, then became completely quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, not sullen quiet, but attentive, interested quiet, the kind of silence that invites revelation rather than demanding it, as I expected. He began talking immediately. The silence made him uncomfortable, so he filled it with words. He talked about his recent military victories, describing each battle in elaborate detail. He explained his strategic philosophy and why other commanders were inferior to him. He shared his concerns about mutual enemies and his frustrations with incompetent allies. I listened without judgment or interruption. I nodded when he made valid points. I asked 1 or 2 simple, open-ended questions that encouraged him to continue sharing. What made that strategy so effective? And how did you know that was the right moment to attack? Something remarkable happened as the conversation continued. The more space I gave him to talk, the more he revealed information I could never have extracted through direct questioning. Within 2 hours, I knew his exact troop numbers, his current supply situation, his genuine fears about the loyalty of his own generals, and his real reasons for wanting this alliance. He was in a much weaker position than his reputation suggested, and desperately needed reliable partners. But the most powerful moment came when he finally paused and asked, "So, what do you think about all this?" I waited for nearly 30 seconds before responding, long enough that he began to shift uncomfortably in his chair and look uncertain for the first time in our meeting. Then I said quietly, "I think you need this alliance more than I do, but I genuinely want it to work for both of us." What would make this partnership worth your while in the long term? That pause completely shifted the dynamic between us. He suddenly realized that I wasn't desperate for his approval, wasn't intimidated by his legendary temper, and wasn't begging for his favor like every other person who sought his cooperation. I was considering his proposal as an equal and making my own judgment about whether it was worth pursuing. The silence had communicated more about my confidence and self-respect than any amount of boasting or arguing could have achieved. From that moment forward, he treated me as a peer rather than a supplicant, and our eventual agreement reflected that equality. This experience taught me that there are three distinct types of strategic silence, each serving different purposes in maintaining control of conversations and relationships. The first is listening silence, staying quiet specifically to gather information that people will share if you simply give them space to talk. Most people are uncomfortable with quiet moments and will fill them with words, often revealing much more than they intended. The second type is thinking silence, pausing before you respond, so you can choose your words carefully and consider the implications of what you're about to say. Most people respond to questions immediately, which frequently leads to saying things they later regret or making commitments they haven't fully considered. A 5-second pause makes you appear thoughtful and gives you crucial time to formulate the best possible response. The third type is power silence, staying quiet specifically to make others uncomfortable enough that they reveal their true intentions, make concessions they weren't planning to make, or agree to terms they haven't thought through completely. When someone makes a demand or presents an ultimatum, instead of immediately arguing or negotiating, sometimes the most effective response is to look at them calmly and say absolutely nothing. They'll often start explaining themselves, offering compromises, or revealing what they're actually worried about. The difference between weak leaders and strong leaders becomes clear when you watch how they pursue what they want. Weak leaders chase their objectives desperately, creating the very resistance they're trying to overcome. Strong leaders position themselves so that what they want comes to them naturally, drawn by attraction rather than captured through pursuit. I learned this principle by spending mornings at the village lake, watching two different types of fishermen at work. The desperate fishermen would wade into the water, splashing loudly as they chased schools of fish with their nets. They worked harder than anyone else, exhausted themselves completely, and consistently caught fewer fish than their patient counterparts. The wise fishermen would arrive before dawn, study the water conditions carefully, set their nets in strategic locations, use bait that attracted their target species, then wait calmly for fish to come to them. They worked less, but achieved more because they understood that chasing fish scares them away, while creating the right conditions draws them toward you. I applied this same principle to warfare, with results that surprised even my most experienced generals. There was a particular campaign where an enemy commander named General Liu had superior numbers, better equipment, and secure supply lines. Any direct confrontation would have favored him significantly. But he had one crucial weakness: he was impatient and proud. Exactly the combination that could be exploited through strategic attraction. Instead of attacking his forces or challenging him to battle, I positioned my army near a strategic bridge that controlled access to the mountain passes beyond. I then carefully orchestrated a campaign of apparent weakness designed to make him come to me on ground of my choosing. I had my scouts allow themselves to be spotted near the bridge during daylight hours, apparently conducting reconnaissance for a retreat across the river. I ordered supply wagons moved in that direction when I knew his spies were watching, creating the impression that we were preparing to abandon our current position. I even had my engineers make obvious preparations for demolishing the bridge, suggesting we planned to retreat across it and then prevent his pursuit. Every piece of intelligence his spies gathered supported the same conclusion: my forces were preparing to withdraw across the bridge. and if he moved quickly, he could cut off our retreat and win a decisive victory without having to fight a difficult siege or battle on unfavorable terrain. General Liu took the bait exactly as I had hoped, eager for a victory that would enhance his reputation and end the campaign quickly. He force-marched his army toward the bridge, covering in 2 days a distance that should have taken 3. His soldiers arrived exhausted while mine were rested and positioned exactly where I wanted them. What he thought was pursuing a retreating enemy turned out to be walking into a carefully prepared trap. The bridge he expected to capture was defended by prepared positions on high ground. His larger army was forced to approach through a narrow valley where superior numbers provided no advantage. His tired troops, who had marched hard to catch what they thought was a fleeing enemy, found themselves attacking rested soldiers who had spent days preparing for exactly this encounter. By appearing weak and vulnerable, I had made him come to me at the time and place where I was strongest while he was weakest. His numerical advantage became meaningless when he couldn't deploy it effectively, and his better equipment couldn't overcome the disadvantage of attacking uphill against prepared defenses. This victory taught me something crucial about human psychology that applies far beyond military situations. When people chase something desperately, they become less attractive and less powerful, which makes them less likely to get what they want. Desperation repels the very things and people we're trying to attract. But when you position yourself as valuable and make others come to you, you appear confident and worth pursuing. I once needed to form an alliance with a proud general who had refused my previous diplomatic approaches. Instead of continuing to send messengers requesting meetings, I stopped contacting him entirely. Instead, I began sharing successful military strategies with his neighbors and rival commanders, always making sure that word of these collaborations reached his territory within 3 months. Stories were circulating about the effectiveness of my tactical advice and the victories achieved by commanders who had implemented my suggestions. My reputation as a strategic advisor grew throughout the region, while I made no direct effort to promote myself to the general who had initially rejected my approaches. Finally, he sent his own messengers, requesting a meeting. When we eventually sat down together, he treated me as someone whose knowledge and partnership he valued, not as someone begging for his attention. The alliance he had previously refused, he now eagerly proposed himself, offering better terms than I had originally requested, because he had convinced himself that working with me would benefit his own objectives. The psychology of attraction works in every area of life because it's based on fundamental human nature. People value what seems valuable, pursue what appears to be in demand, and respect what doesn't desperately need their approval. A scholar's brush shapes thoughts more precisely than a warrior's sword shapes battles, but only if you understand how to use it properly. Questions are like brushes. They guide minds toward conclusions, reveal hidden truths, and influence decisions, without appearing to impose control. The person asking strategic questions controls the direction of any conversation, even when they never provide direct answers. I discovered the true power of questioning during one of the most dangerous situations of my career. One of my most trusted generals, Commander Wei, was secretly plotting against me. I had reliable intelligence about his betrayal. He had been meeting with enemy agents, questioning my decisions behind my back, and encouraging doubt among junior officers about my leadership. However, confronting him directly with accusations would have forced him into a corner where he might act desperately, possibly assassinating me or defecting to our enemies with crucial military secrets. I needed him to confess voluntarily and choose loyalty over treachery, which required a much more sophisticated approach than direct confrontation. I invited him to my private chambers for what I described as a strategic consultation about maintaining army loyalty and discipline. As we sat together reviewing maps and reports, I began asking him carefully constructed questions that would lead him to judge his own behavior. "Commander Wei," I began, "you've served with distinction for many years. What do you think are the most important signs of loyalty in our officer corps?" He immediately assured me that everyone was completely committed to our cause, and that I had nothing to worry about regarding the faithfulness of my commanders. "That's reassuring to hear," I replied, "but if you were in my position, what warning signs would concern you? What behaviors would make you suspicious that an officer might be wavering in his commitment?" Without realizing what he was doing, Wei began describing exactly the kind of activities he had been engaging in: secret meetings with unauthorized personnel, private criticism of command decisions, and subtle efforts to undermine confidence. "In leadership, those are precisely the behaviors that would worry me," I agreed. "Now, if you discovered that a trusted general was exhibiting such concerning patterns, how would you handle the situation? Would you confront him immediately, or would you try to understand his motivations first?" By this point in our conversation, Wei was essentially describing his own betrayal and explaining why it deserved punishment, but he was doing so as if he were helping me solve a theoretical problem rather than confessing to actual treason. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that such a general might be acting from fear rather than malice. Perhaps he's worried about the army's chances of success, or concerned that his family might suffer if we lose this campaign. A wise commander might give him an opportunity to explain his actions and choose a better path." That was the opening I had been guiding him toward. "What would you do," I asked quietly, "if you discovered that you were the general we've been discussing?" The question hung in the air between us for several long moments. Wei's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, fear, and finally resignation. He had talked himself into understanding his own situation and recognizing that confession was better than discovery. "I would tell you the truth," he said finally, "and hope that your wisdom extended to forgiveness for someone who lost his way but wants to find it again." What happened in that conversation demonstrates the 5 types of questions that shift power in your favor in any situation. Information questions like "what concerns you most about this situation?" reveal what people are really thinking and what motivates their actions. These questions bypass defensiveness because they ask for opinions rather than making accusations. Assumption questions like "what makes you believe that approach will work?" force people to examine their reasoning and often expose flaws in their logic or gaps in their information. People rarely question their own assumptions until someone guides them to do so through careful inquiry. Consequence questions, like "what happens if we don't address this issue?" help people think through implications they might be avoiding or haven't fully considered. Most people focus on immediate benefits while ignoring long-term costs, and these questions redirect attention to the full picture. Priority questions, like "if you could only solve one of these problems, which would it be?" reveal what people value most and where they're willing to compromise. Understanding someone's priorities gives you tremendous insight into how to structure proposals and negotiations. Commitment questions, like "what would need to be true for you to feel confident about this decision?" turn abstract discussions into concrete requirements and help people convince themselves to take action rather than continuing to debate possibilities. The beauty of strategic questioning is that people trust conclusions they reach themselves more than conclusions you give them directly. When you tell someone what to think, they might resist or doubt your reasoning. When you guide them to the right conclusion through thoughtful questions, they feel ownership of the idea and become invested in acting on it. Questions also deflect attacks more effectively than arguments do. When someone accuses you of poor judgment, instead of defending your decisions, ask, "what specific information would change your assessment of this situation?" When someone demands immediate action, instead of refusing, ask, "what are the risks of taking more time to consider our options?" I keep puppet strings on my desk, not as toys, but as reminders of the most sophisticated form of influence, making others feel powerful and autonomous, while subtly guiding their choices toward outcomes you prefer. The greatest control is invisible. Control, where people believe they're making independent decisions while you're carefully shaping the options they're choosing between. This principle became essential to my survival during a campaign where I served under General Cao, a commander who outranked me significantly but whose tactical incompetence threatened to get our entire army killed. His strategies were based on outdated thinking, his timing was consistently poor, and his understanding of our enemy's capabilities was dangerously inaccurate. However, challenging him directly would have meant execution for insubordination, regardless of whether my military judgment was superior to his. I needed to lead without appearing to lead, to influence his decisions without undermining his authority, and to save our army while allowing him to maintain face as the commanding officer. I began by asking for his guidance on tactical details that seemed minor but were actually crucial to our success. General Cao, I would say, given your extensive experience with cavalry operations, should we position our mounted units on the left flank, where they can exploit the enemy's weak cavalry screen, or on the right flank, where they can support our infantry advance? Both positions, I suggested, were strategically sound. I had analyzed the situation carefully and determined that either choice would work effectively. But by presenting options rather than making recommendations, I made him feel like the tactical mastermind while ensuring we followed effective strategies, regardless of which specific option he selected. You raise an excellent point about their weak cavalry screen, he would reply, choosing the left flank position. Yes, we'll position our mounted units there to exploit that weakness. He felt brilliant for recognizing the tactical opportunity, never realizing that I had designed both options to take advantage of the same enemy vulnerability. Gradually, I expanded this approach to more significant strategic decisions. General, I've been studying the terrain and enemy dispositions, and I can see 3 possible approaches for tomorrow's engagement. Which one best matches your vision for achieving victory? Again, all 3 strategies I presented were fundamentally sound. I had crafted them specifically to work regardless of which he chose. But giving him the choice made him feel like the strategic genius orchestrating our success. The psychology behind this approach is based on a fundamental human need that most people don't recognize in themselves. Everyone, especially those in positions of authority, needs to feel in control of their circumstances and respected for their judgment. When you try to take control away from them directly, they resist instinctively, even when your suggestions would benefit them. But when you give them meaningful choices within parameters you've carefully designed, they feel empowered while you maintain strategic influence over outcomes. I applied this same principle to resolve a bitter dispute between 2 provincial governors who had been arguing for months over water rights to a river that formed the boundary between their territories. Both governors had appealed to me for mediation, but both were proud men who would resist any solution that seemed imposed from outside their own authority. Instead of proposing a single solution and trying to convince them to accept it, I presented them with 3 different frameworks for sharing the water rights, each structured differently but all achieving essentially the same practical result of fair distribution, based on seasonal needs and historical usage patterns. Gentlemen, I told them, you both want what's best for your people, and you both understand the importance of this river to your province's prosperity. I've studied similar disputes in other regions, and I can see 3 approaches that have worked successfully. Which framework seems most fair and practical to you? They spent hours debating the relative merits of each option, feeling like they were negotiating as equals and making important decisions about their province's futures. In reality, any choice they made would solve the fundamental problem of water distribution while establishing useful precedents for resolving future disputes. The key to making this approach work effectively is offering genuinely meaningful choices, not fake alternatives where only one option is actually viable. If you present alternatives where the correct choice is obvious, or where the other options are deliberately inferior, people will sense the manipulation and become resentful rather than cooperative. Real strategic choice giving means creating multiple paths to the same essential destination, where each path has genuine advantages and reflects different but legitimate approaches to solving the problem. This requires more work and creativity than simply telling people what to do, but it produces much better long-term results because people support what they feel they helped create. I learned to distinguish between real control and the appearance of control, and to value the former over the latter. Real control means your desired outcomes happen regardless of which specific methods are used to achieve them. Apparent control means you get to make obvious decisions and give direct orders. But people resist your authority and undermine your objectives. With my superiors, I would say, we could approach this situation in several ways. What's your preference? With my subordinates, I would say, here are the constraints we're working within and the objectives we need to achieve. How do you think we should proceed? In both cases, I maintain strategic influence while allowing others to feel ownership of the decisions being made. The ultimate goal is becoming someone others turn to for well-designed options rather than someone who imposes solutions. When people trust your judgment in presenting choices, you gain more sustainable influence than if you simply gave orders that might be resented or ignored. My ancient water clock taught me the most important lesson about timing. Water doesn't force its way through obstacles or rush to reach its destination. Instead, it accumulates patience, studies the resistance it faces, waits for the exact moment when barriers weaken, then flows through with irresistible power. In controlling any situation, timing matters more than strength, more than resources, more than brilliant strategy. I learned this principle during a siege that tested every aspect of my understanding about patience and strategic timing. The enemy city of Yangshan was exceptionally well fortified, with walls 30 feet high, towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and supplies sufficient to withstand a lengthy blockade. The defenders were disciplined, experienced, and completely committed to resisting our forces. My generals were eager for immediate action. We have superior numbers and siege equipment, they argued repeatedly. Why should we waste time and resources on a prolonged siege when we could take the city by storm and end this campaign quickly? Their frustration was understandable. Soldiers and commanders alike prefer decisive action to uncertain waiting. But I had observed something they missed during my careful reconnaissance of the city and its patterns of daily life. Yangshan went through predictable cycles that created temporary vulnerabilities, but only for those patient enough to wait for the right convergence of conditions. During harvest season, which occurred twice yearly, large parties of citizens were permitted to leave the city under armed guard to gather grain from fields that lay outside the walls but within our siege perimeter. These expeditions created opportunities for intelligence gathering and possible infiltration, but only during specific weeks when crops were ready for harvesting. During the harsh winter months, guards spent most of their time inside stone towers, rather than patrolling the walls, seeking warmth around braziers and reducing their vigilance to the minimum levels necessary to avoid punishment. The cold made them sluggish and inattentive, but this advantage was only available during the coldest weeks of the year. During spring festivals, particularly the annual celebration honoring their city's patron deity, even the most disciplined soldiers relaxed their vigilance as attention turned inward toward ceremonial activities rather than outward toward external threats. Wine flowed freely during these celebrations, discipline became casual, and normal security procedures were reduced to skeleton crews. Most importantly, I learned through careful observation and intelligence from inside sources that the city's food supplies, while substantial, followed a predictable cycle of abundance and scarcity based on storage capabilities and seasonal consumption patterns. I decided to wait for the perfect convergence of multiple favorable conditions rather than attacking when only one or two advantages were available. This required patience that frustrated my officers and tested the discipline of my troops, but I knew that premature action would waste the opportunities that patience could create. After nearly 3 years of siege, the conditions finally aligned perfectly. A particularly harsh winter had forced the defenders to consume stored food more rapidly than usual, reducing their reserves significantly. A spring plague had weakened their garrison, killing some guards and leaving others too sick to perform their duties effectively. Most importantly, their annual spring festival was approaching, the one celebration where even their most professional soldiers would be distracted by wine, ceremonies, and the presence of their families. On the second night of their festival, when guard posts were minimally staffed and attention was focused on celebrations in the city center, we scaled their walls using rope ladders and grappling hooks. The few guards who were on duty were drowsy from wine and distracted by the sounds of celebration below them by sunrise. We controlled their gates and the city surrendered without the massive battle that would have cost thousands of lives if we had attacked when conditions were less favorable. 3 years of patient preparation had achieved what immediate force could never have: accomplished victory with minimal casualties on both sides. This experience taught me to recognize the 3 phases that every conflict goes through, regardless of its scale or nature. The preparation phase is when positions are established, resources are gathered, intelligence is collected, and foundations are laid for eventual action. Most people rush through this phase because it feels like nothing important is happening, but preparation determines what becomes possible later. The tension phase is when opposing forces test each other, probe for weaknesses, establish relative strengths, and create the conditions that will determine how the conflict resolves. This phase often lasts much longer than people expect and requires tremendous discipline to navigate, without making premature commitments or revealing your true capabilities too early. The resolution phase is when decisive action becomes both possible and necessary, when the accumulation of preparation and tension creates opportunities for outcomes that weren't available earlier. This phase often happens very quickly, requiring immediate execution of plans that have been developed over much longer periods. Most people try to rush directly to resolution without properly managing preparation and tension. They want immediate results, immediate answers, immediate victories. But water doesn't rush, it accumulates pressure gradually until the moment arrives when irresistible force can be applied with maximum effectiveness. I once waited 5 years to resolve a personal dispute with General Hahn, a rival commander who had publicly insulted my family honor and questioned my military competence. My officers expected immediate retaliation through either formal challenge or political maneuvering. But I recognized that Han currently enjoyed the favor of the royal court and was protected by powerful allies, who would defend him against any direct attack on his reputation. Instead of striking when I was weak and he was strong, I focused on patient positioning and careful timing. Over those 5 years, I quietly built my own reputation through successful campaigns and wise counsel, while Han's influence gradually declined through a series of minor failures and political misjudgments. When the court finally needed someone to lead their most important military campaign, they chose me over Han because my recent successes had overshadowed his past achievements. My patient positioning had completely reversed our relative power and status, transforming what would have been a difficult confrontation into an effortless victory. The willow branch bends gracefully in the storm, while the mighty oak rigid and proud, breaks under pressure it cannot yield to. This simple observation from nature changed my entire approach to conflict and taught me that the strongest response to force is often not greater force, but intelligent redirection that turns opponents' strength against them. I faced this principle's most dramatic test when an enemy army twice the size of mine began marching toward our position with the clear intention of crushing us through overwhelming numerical superiority. Their commander, General Liu, was famous throughout the region for his aggressive frontal assaults that had destroyed every opponent through sheer mass and momentum. His tactical approach was brutally simple but historically effective. Concentrate overwhelming force at the enemy's strongest point. Attack with such massive numbers that resistance becomes impossible, and maintain constant pressure until the opponent's will to fight collapses completely. He had used this strategy to win dozens of battles against commanders who had tried to match his strength with their own strength. My generals wanted to retreat immediately. When scouts brought word of his approaching army, "We cannot possibly match their numbers," they argued reasonably. Fighting them directly would be suicide for our forces. We should withdraw to more defensible positions and hope to find allies who can help us achieve numerical parity. Were absolutely correct about not being able to match Liu's strength directly, but completely wrong about what that meant for our strategic options. Instead of retreating or trying to find ways to increase our own force, I spent several days studying their approach more carefully, looking for ways that their greatest asset could become their greatest vulnerability. A massive army has inherent weaknesses that smaller forces don't face. It moves slowly because coordinating the movements of thousands of soldiers across varied terrain requires extensive planning and communication. It consumes enormous quantities of food, water, and equipment, creating supply lines that stretch for miles and require constant protection. It generates huge amounts of dust, noise, and other signs that announce its presence and intentions from great distances. Most importantly, a very large army depends completely on maintaining formation and momentum to be effective. Disrupt either the organization or the forward progress, and thousands of individual soldiers become a confused, vulnerable mob rather than a coordinated fighting force. I divided my smaller army into 5 mobile units and positioned them strategically along Liu's anticipated route of march. Instead of concentrating our forces to meet his concentrated forces, which would have resulted in our certain destruction, I dispersed our strength to attack his weaknesses simultaneously. As his massive column approached our region, we struck, not at his soldiers but at his support systems. The first unit attacked his food supply wagons, destroying provisions and scattering the oxen that pulled his supply carts. The second unit targeted his weapon reserves and ammunition stores, reducing his army's ability to sustain combat. The third unit focused on his communication systems, capturing message riders and disrupting the coordination between his various divisions. The fourth unit harassed his rearguard constantly, preventing them from resting properly and creating the impression that our forces were larger and more numerous than they actually were. The fifth unit, which I commanded personally, stayed ahead of his main column and destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and created obstacles that slowed his advance, while forcing him to expend energy on engineering problems rather than military objectives. Within just 2 days, Liu's greatest asset, his massive army, had become his greatest liability. He couldn't feed his soldiers adequately because their supply wagons had been destroyed. He couldn't coordinate movements between his scattered units because his communication systems had been disrupted. He couldn't maintain the rapid advance that his strategy required because his troops were exhausted from constant harassment and obstacles. Most importantly, his soldiers began to lose confidence in their commander's ability to protect them and lead them to victory. Instead of feeling like part of an invincible force, they felt vulnerable and isolated, uncertain about their mission and doubtful about their chances of success. When Lu's army finally reached our main defensive position, they were already defeated. Psychologically, even though we hadn't fought a single major battle, his massive force had become a hungry, disorganized, demoralized collection of individual soldiers, rather than the coordinated fighting machine that had terrorized other opponents. His attempt to maintain his traditional aggressive strategy failed, completely because hungry, confused soldiers cannot execute complex maneuvers effectively. We didn't need to match his strength. We had used his strength to destroy itself through the simple principle of turning his advantages into disadvantages. This victory taught me that every strength contains the seeds of its own weakness. When pushed beyond appropriate limits or applied in unsuitable circumstances, aggressive people can be provoked into overextending themselves and making mistakes they would normally avoid. Careful, methodical people can be paralyzed by too many options or overwhelmed by rapidly changing situations. Confident people can be led into situations where their confidence becomes dangerous. Arrogance. I once dealt with a rival at court named Minister Chen, who was known throughout the capital for his brilliant rhetorical skills and his ability to humiliate opponents. In public debates, everyone who had tried to argue with him directly had been destroyed intellectually, their reputations damaged, and their influence diminished. Instead of challenging his debating skills with my own, I used his intellectual pride against him by creating situations where his greatest strength became a social liability. I began asking him to explain complex philosophical questions during public gatherings, where the audience included many people without formal education. His need to demonstrate intellectual superiority made him give long, complicated answers filled with classical references and abstract concepts that most people couldn't follow or appreciate. The more brilliantly he spoke, the more he isolated himself from his audience and appeared arrogant rather than wise. Within several months, people began avoiding conversations with Chen because they felt intimidated and excluded by his superior knowledge. His reputation shifted from brilliant scholar to arrogant intellectual who looks down on ordinary people. His greatest asset, his intelligence, had become a social weakness because he couldn't resist displaying it inappropriately. The key to applying this principle effectively is recognizing that every strength pushed too far becomes a weakness. Persistence becomes stubbornness. Confidence becomes arrogance. Caution becomes paralysis. Flexibility becomes inconsistency. Strength becomes rigidity. But remember, this approach isn't about being destructive or manipulative for personal gain. It's about understanding natural forces and working with them rather than against them. Like the willow that survives storms by bending rather than breaking, the mountain path taught me that sometimes you must step backward to move forward. That retreat can be the strongest possible advance when executed with wisdom rather than desperation. There came a day when my army could have won an immediate battle, but winning that battle would have cost us the entire war. Learning when to retreat, how to retreat with strength rather than weakness, became one of my most valuable leadership skills. We had been pursuing General Ma's forces for 3 weeks after they had conducted a series of raids against our supply convoys. These weren't random attacks, they were carefully coordinated. Strikes designed to weaken our logistical capabilities while avoiding direct confrontation with our main army. Ma was an elusive commander who preferred mobility and harassment to conventional battles. Finally, our scouts reported that we had cornered his forces in a narrow valley with steep walls on both sides and only one apparent exit route. My officers were jubilant at the prospect of ending this frustrating campaign. "Today we finish this," they declared with satisfaction. "Ma has finally made a mistake, and we'll make him pay for every supply wagon he destroyed." Victory seemed not only possible, but inevitable. We had Ma's army trapped in terrain that favored us significantly. Our forces were fresh and well supplied, while his troops had been living rough in the mountains for weeks. We had numerical superiority and better equipment. Every tactical analysis suggested that tomorrow's battle would result in complete victory for our side. But something about the situation troubled me deeply. Ma was too experienced a commander to allow himself to be trapped accidentally, and too clever to make the kind of elementary mistake that would result in the destruction of his entire army. His calm demeanor when our scouts observed his camp suggested confidence rather than desperation. I spent the entire night studying our position and Ma's likely intentions, and gradually I began to understand the truth. This wasn't a trap we had driven him into, it was a trap he had led us into. For 3 weeks, he had been drawing us deeper into mountain territory that he knew intimately while we knew hardly at all. He had been pulling us away from our own supply lines, away from potential reinforcements, away from the familiar terrain where our advantages would be most pronounced. The trapped position he had chosen wasn't as hopeless as it appeared. Our scouts had identified one obvious exit from the valley, but more careful reconnaissance revealed several narrow paths that could allow small groups to escape under cover of darkness. More importantly, the valley provided excellent defensive positions that would make our numerical advantage largely irrelevant at dawn. Instead of ordering the attack my officers expected, I commanded a full withdrawal from the valley. The reaction was immediate and explosive. "We have them beaten," General Wang protested angrily. "How can we retreat when victory is within our grasp? This goes against every principle of warfare." Some of my younger officers openly questioned my courage and judgment. Others wondered aloud whether I had lost my nerve at the crucial moment. The disappointment and confusion among my troops was palpable. They had been preparing for a decisive victory, and instead they were being ordered to abandon what appeared to be a perfect opportunity. But as we withdrew in good order, maintaining discipline and defensive formations, scouts brought urgent intelligence that validated my decision completely. A much larger enemy, force nearly 3 times the size of our army, was approaching the valley from the western passes. These were Ma's reinforcements, positioning themselves to surround us completely if we had stayed to fight his trapped forces. Our certain victory would have become total annihilation within hours. We would have been caught between Ma's defensive positions in the valley and his reinforcements attacking from behind, with no escape route and no possibility of survival. My decision to retreat when we appeared to be winning had saved our entire army from destruction. 6 months later, we encountered the same enemy forces again, but this time on terrain of our choosing and with complete intelligence about their numbers and capabilities. The battle we fought then was decisive and overwhelming in our favor, precisely because we had preserved our strength and chosen better conditions for the confrontation. That experience taught me the crucial difference between giving up and strategic withdrawal. Giving up means abandoning your objectives because obstacles seem insurmountable or because you lack the will to continue pursuing your goals. Strategic withdrawal means temporarily stepping back from immediate objectives in order to achieve your larger goals more effectively under better circumstances. The hardest part of strategic retreat is managing your own ego and the expectations of others. Everyone expects leaders to always advance, always attack, always push forward aggressively. Retreating feels like admitting failure or weakness, even when it represents the most intelligent possible response to current conditions. I learned to recognize 5 specific situations where retreat is stronger than advance, regardless of how the decision might appear to others. When you're fighting on ground that favors your opponent much more than it favors you, tactical withdrawal to better terrain often transforms the entire strategic situation. When you're emotionally reactive rather than strategically clear, stepping back allows you to regain perspective and make better decisions. When winning the current battle would consume resources you need for more important future battles, temporary retreat preserves your capacity for ultimate victory. When your opponent is obviously trying to provoke you into premature action, retreat. Disappoints their strategy while maintaining your options. When you don't have complete information about what you're facing, withdrawal buys time for intelligence gathering that could prevent disasters. My diplomatic seal represents the most sophisticated victories, agreements that appear perfectly fair to everyone involved, while secretly favoring those wise enough to structure them properly. The greatest negotiations leave your opponents feeling satisfied, even grateful, while you achieve more than if you had simply demanded everything you wanted through force or manipulation. I learnt this principle during one of the most complex diplomatic challenges of my career. 3 kingdoms, the mountain realm of Shao, the river kingdom of Wei, and the southern empire of Ka, were locked in an increasingly dangerous conflict over control of Dragon's Gate Pass, a strategic mountain passage that controlled the most important trade route between the eastern and western regions of our continent. Each kingdom had legitimate historical claims to the territory. Shao argued that their ancestors had built the original fortress and maintained the roads for centuries. Wei claimed that their merchants had developed the trade routes and their taxes had funded most of the pass's improvements. Ku insisted that their military had defended the region against foreign invasions and earned sovereignty through blood and sacrifice. More problematically, each kingdom had positioned armies near the pass, creating a volatile situation where any incident could trigger a 3-way war that would devastate the entire region. The economic consequences alone would be catastrophic. Trade route generated enormous wealth for all 3 kingdoms, and its destruction would impoverish millions of people who depended on commerce for their livelihoods. All 3 rulers had asked me to mediate their dispute because none trusted the others enough to negotiate directly, and because my reputation for fairness made me acceptable to all parties. However, I quickly realized that traditional approaches to this conflict would fail completely. The obvious solution would be to divide the territory into 3 sections, giving each kingdom a portion of what they claimed. But the pass was a single, strategic unit that couldn't be effectively governed by multiple authorities without creating constant friction and inefficiency. Dividing control would satisfy no one while making the trade route less valuable to everyone. Instead of focusing on territorial ownership, I spent weeks understanding what each ruler actually hoped to gain from controlling the pass, beyond the symbolic satisfaction of winning a political victory. Through careful questioning and private conversations, I discovered that their real interests were quite different from their stated positions. King Li of Shao was primarily concerned about the customs revenue generated by taxing goods that traveled through the pass. His kingdom's mountainous terrain made agriculture difficult, and trade taxes were essential to his treasury stability. He wanted control of the pass, mainly to ensure reliable income for his government. Queen Chen of Wei was most worried about guaranteed access for her merchants and predictable transit costs for goods flowing between her territory and eastern markets. Her kingdom's prosperity depended on trade, and she feared that hostile control of the pass could strangle her economy through prohibitive taxes or arbitrary restrictions. Emperor Wu of Ku was focused on military security and strategic defense. His primary concern was preventing enemies from using the pass to invade his territory, and ensuring that his own forces could move through it quickly when necessary for defensive purposes. Once I understood their real motivations rather than their negotiating positions, I could design a solution that gave each ruler what they actually needed while creating something more valuable than simple territorial control. I proposed establishing a joint authority to govern Dragon's Gate Pass, with rotating administrative control that changed according to seasonal trade patterns. During spring and summer, when trade volume was highest, Wei would have primary administrative authority because their expertise in commerce would maximize the pass's efficiency and profitability. During autumn harvest season, when tax collection was most crucial. Zhao would assume administrative control and oversee the customs operations that were vital to their kingdom's finances. During winter, when military concerns were paramount due to increased risk of raids and invasions, Ku would take administrative responsibility and focus on defensive preparations. The customs revenue would be divided according to a formula based on each kingdom's historical usage of the trade route, with Wei receiving the largest share due to their merchants' heavy reliance on the pass, Zhao receiving substantial revenue to support their government, and Shu receiving enough to maintain their military installations. Most importantly, all three kingdoms would guarantee military access for each other's forces when defending against external threats, while prohibiting the pass's use by any foreign armies or hostile forces. Each ruler achieved what they truly wanted. King Li secured reliable customs revenue without the expense of maintaining full military occupation. Queen Chen obtained guaranteed trade access with predictable costs and no risk of economic warfare. Emperor Wu got military security and defensive cooperation that protected his borders better than exclusive control would have provided. But I had structured the agreement so that my role as mediator became essential to the system's operation. Any disputes about administrative transitions would require my arbitration. Any modifications to the revenue-sharing formula would need my approval. Any conflicts between the kingdoms over pass usage would come to me for resolution. I had become, effectively, the fourth power in the region, with influence over all three kingdoms and a permanent role in their most important economic and strategic decisions. They had each one what they wanted most, but I had positioned myself as indispensable to their continued success. Life rarely sends you problems. One at a time they arrive in clusters, like enemy armies attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, testing your ability to maintain strategic thinking while managing urgent crises. My war room map, covered with colored markers representing different threats and opportunities, taught me how to coordinate responses to several conflicts at once without losing control of any single situation. I faced this ultimate test during what my advisors called the season of troubles, a period when everything that could go wrong seemed to go wrong at exactly the same time. Within a single month, I was confronting 3 separate enemy armies, approaching our territory from different directions. A brewing rebellion among my own generals who questioned my ability to handle multiple threats. Political intrigue at the royal court designed to undermine my authority and remove me from command. Supply shortages that threatened to starve my troops before any battles could be fought, and reports of plague spreading through our civilian population. My junior officers were completely overwhelmed by the complexity of managing so many simultaneous crises. They approached each problem as if it was separate and equally urgent, trying to solve everything at once through frantic activity and reactive decision-making. They wanted to march immediately against the closest enemy army, arrest the rebellious generals before their discontent spread further, send urgent messages to court defending my leadership, and conduct desperate raids against neighboring territories to seize the supplies we needed. Their approach would have scattered our forces impossibly thin, exhausted our resources, and solved none of our problems effectively. Worse, it would have demonstrated exactly the kind of panicked leadership that our enemies were hoping to provoke and our critics were expecting to see. Instead, I spent 2 crucial days studying how these apparently separate crises were actually connected, looking for ways that solutions to one problem could create benefits for addressing other problems simultaneously. What I discovered was that most of our difficulties were not independent disasters, but parts of a coordinated strategy designed to overwhelm our decision-making capacity. The rebellion among my generals was happening primarily because they felt hopeless about our ability to defeat 3 enemy armies while dealing with supply shortages and political pressure. Their discontent wasn't really about my leadership, was about their fear that we were facing impossible odds and heading towards certain defeat. The political intrigue at court was carefully timed to coincide with our military difficulties, designed to force me into desperate actions that would justify removing me from command. My enemies at court were hoping I would make emotional decisions that would prove their claims about my poor judgment. The three enemy armies had coordinated their timing specifically to stretch our defenses beyond breaking point while preventing us from concentrating our forces against any single threat. They were counting on our inability to fight effectively on multiple fronts simultaneously. Even the supply shortages were partly artificial, caused by merchants who were hedging their bets about the outcome of our conflicts and reluctant to extend credit to a command that might not survive to pay its debts. Recognizing these connections revealed how I could address multiple problems with carefully designed single actions that created cascading benefits throughout our entire situation. First, I sent a message to General Joe, the most reasonable of the three enemy commanders, proposing a temporary truce in exchange for intelligence about his allies' military plans and political objectives. This immediately reduced our immediate military pressure while creating the possibility of dividing our opponents against each other. The truce negotiation also demonstrated to my own generals that I was thinking strategically rather than just reacting desperately to circumstances, which began to restore their confidence in our prospects for survival and victory. Second, I promoted two of the most vocal critics among my general staff to positions where they became directly responsible for solving our supply crisis. Instead of treating their complaints as disloyalty requiring punishment, I channeled their energy into constructive problem solving that addressed their legitimate concerns while making them invested in our success rather than focused on my failure. This promotion strategy also sent a clear message to other potentially rebellious officers that dissent would be met with increased responsibility rather than punishment, encouraging them to contribute solutions rather than just voicing complaints. Third, I used our network of court informants to spread carefully crafted rumors that I was considering resigning my command due to the impossible circumstances I was facing. This intelligence made my political enemies relax their pressure, assuming they had already achieved their objective of destroying my career, while buying me time to improve our actual strategic position. The resignation rumors also reached the enemy commanders, who began planning for a longer campaign against my supposedly demoralized and leaderless forces, giving us additional time to prepare our defenses and coordinate our responses. Each action I took addressed multiple problems simultaneously, while creating new opportunities that hadn't existed when I was treating each crisis as a separate emergency. The truce negotiation reduced military pressure while gathering intelligence and dividing our enemies. The strategic promotions converted potential traitors into motivated allies while solving practical supply problems. The resignation rumors reduced political pressure while creating strategic deception opportunities. Within 2 weeks, the supply crisis was resolved through the efforts of my newly motivated logistics officers. The rebellion had ended because my generals could see realistic paths to victory rather than just impossible challenges. The political pressure had decreased because my enemies thought they had already won. Most importantly, I had detailed knowledge of enemy plans and capabilities that allowed us to choose when and where to engage them on terms favorable to our forces. When I finally decided to fight, it was with unified command, adequate supplies, reduced political interference, and superior intelligence about enemy intentions and capabilities. I keep a tiger's eye stone on my desk as a reminder that true power radiates from presence and controlled intensity, not from threats, violence, or dramatic displays of force. The most effective intimidation happens in the mind, where people's imagination of what might happen often creates more influence than what actually does happen. I learned this lesson during one of the most dangerous confrontations of my political career. Governor Feng of the Western Province had been systematically ignoring royal decrees, building his own private army, and collecting taxes that should have been sent to the imperial treasury. Intelligence reports suggested he was planning open rebellion within months, possibly in coordination with foreign enemies who would benefit from internal Chinese conflicts. Everyone at court expected me to arrive at his fortress with overwhelming military force, arrest him publicly for treason, and make an example that would deter other potential rebels. The conventional approach would have been to surround his stronghold with troops, demand his immediate surrender, and execute him if he refused to comply. Instead, I decided to try something that had never been attempted in similar situations. I traveled to his province alone, without guards or weapons, and presented myself at his gate requesting a private audience to discuss matters of mutual concern. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. Governor Feng had prepared for military confrontation, political maneuvering, or diplomatic negotiation backed by implicit threats. He had not prepared for a calm, confident visitor who arrived without protection and seemed completely unconcerned about personal safety. When his guards escorted me to his private chambers, I found him surrounded by maps of troop dispositions, weapons, caches, and correspondence with potential allies, clear evidence of his planned rebellion against imperial authority. Instead of confronting him about the obvious treason or threatening him with consequences, I sat down comfortably and said, "Governor Feng, I came here to ask your advice about a problem I'm facing. What do you think makes some provincial leaders choose loyalty to the empire while others choose the path of destruction?" The effect was immediate and devastating to his confidence. He realized that I knew everything about his plans, but wasn't reacting with anger, threats, or demands for his surrender. My calm presence in a situation where I should theoretically have been arresting him or fighting him made him understand that I possessed information, allies, or capabilities he hadn't anticipated. My complete lack of fear or aggression in his stronghold, surrounded by his weapons and his loyal soldiers, suggested that I was either completely confident in my ability to handle whatever he might do, or that his planned rebellion was already doomed regardless of his local advantages. For 30 minutes, we discussed the psychology of rebellion and the motivations that drive men to choose destruction over cooperation. During this conversation, he gradually realized that his secret communications weren't secret. His private army wasn't really private, and his rebellion wasn't going to succeed because too many people knew about his plans and were prepared to counter them. More importantly, he began to understand that I had come to offer him a choice rather than to demand his surrender. By treating him as someone worth reasoning with rather than just an enemy to be defeated, I had opened the possibility of a face-saving resolution that didn't require his destruction or public humiliation. By the end of our meeting, he was asking how he could demonstrate renewed loyalty to the empire and what role he might play in strengthening imperial authority in the Western provinces rather than undermining it. That conversation ended a potential civil war without a single weapon being drawn or a single threat being made. My presence and controlled intensity had accomplished what violence could never have achieved. I had changed his mind rather than simply defeating his forces, which meant he became a genuine ally rather than a resentful prisoner. This experience taught me the 3 essential elements of psychological intimidation that work far more effectively than physical force or aggressive behavior. The first element is composure under pressure, staying calm and thoughtful when others expect you to be emotional or reactive. When someone insults you, respond with curiosity about their motivations rather than anger about their behavior. When someone threatens you, ask questions about their concerns instead of making. When someone challenges your authority, address their underlying needs Rather than defending your position, the second element is evidence of capability that speaks for itself, rather than requiring boastful explanations. You don't need to tell people what you can do if they can observe what you have already accomplished. Past successes create present respect more effectively than present claims about future actions. The third element is strategic unpredictability, responding in ways that people don't expect, but that demonstrate your confidence and control over the situation. When everyone assumes you'll fight, negotiate instead. When they expect negotiation, act decisively. When they anticipate anger, show genuine curiosity about their perspective. I once ended a potential assassination plot by inviting the would-be assassin to dinner and asking him to explain his grievances against my policies and leadership. My unexpected invitation, when I clearly knew about his plans to kill me, demonstrated that I was neither afraid of him nor ignorant of his intentions. More importantly, it showed that I was confident enough in my position and abilities to risk a face-to-face meeting with someone who had been planning my death, which suggested either tremendous courage or superior preparation that made his plans irrelevant. During our dinner, I listened carefully to his complaints, acknowledged the legitimate issues behind his anger, and offered him a position in my administration where he could address the problems that had motivated his hostility. He became one of my most loyal supporters because I had treated him as a person worth understanding rather than just a threat to be eliminated. The difference between being feared and being respected is crucial for long-term effectiveness. Fear motivates people to oppose you whenever they think they can win or find allies strong enough to protect them. Respect motivates people to work with you even when they disagree with your decisions, because they trust your judgment and believe you have their interests in mind along with your own. A messenger's sealed scroll contains more power than 1,000 warriors, because information shapes reality before reality shapes events. I learned early in my career that controlling what people know, when they learn it, and how they interpret it gives you more lasting influence than controlling armies, territories, or even the loyalty of individual followers. During one of the most challenging campaigns of my military career, I faced an enemy commander whose intelligence network was so sophisticated that every move I made seemed to be anticipated and countered before it could be implemented effectively. General Huang was known throughout the region for his tactical brilliance, but his real advantage lay in his spies, who had infiltrated every level of my command structure. Every strategy I developed was somehow known to my opponents before I could execute it. Every supply movement was intercepted. Every diplomatic initiative was undermined. Every tactical surprise was neutralized because Huang seemed to know my intentions as well as I knew them myself. My traditional response would have been to conduct a massive security investigation, execute suspected spies, and attempt to seal off information leaks through increased secrecy and stricter controls. But I realized that this defensive approach would only confirm to Huang that his intelligence operations were effective, while potentially destroying the trust and communication necessary for effective military leadership. Instead, I decided to transform his intelligence advantage into a weapon I could use against him. Rather than trying to hide information from his spies, I began feeding them exactly the intelligence I wanted him to receive, while using different channels to communicate my real intentions to the officers who needed to know them. I started holding elaborate strategy meetings, where I discussed detailed plans for a major assault against his eastern fortifications. I made sure these meetings included several officers whom I suspected of reporting to Huang, and I encouraged extensive discussion of logistics, timing, and tactical details that would make the deception seem completely authentic. Simultaneously, I had my most trusted lieutenants spread different rumors through informal channels. Stories suggesting that we were running critically low on supplies and might be forced to retreat within days. I arranged for supply wagons to be seen leaving our camp during daylight hours when Huang's scouts could observe them, creating the impression that we were preparing for withdrawal. Meanwhile, I shared completely different intelligence with my inner circle of advisors through secure channels that I was confident hadn't been compromised. This information revealed my actual plan to attack from the north while Huang was reinforcing his eastern defenses and preparing for our supposed retreat. The result was that Huang received three contradictory streams of intelligence about our intentions: reports of a massive eastern assault, rumors of an imminent retreat due to supply shortages, and scattered information, suggesting internal confusion and poor coordination within our command structure. Unable to determine which information was accurate and unwilling to ignore any of it completely, Huang divided his forces to defend against all possible scenarios. He reinforced his eastern fortifications against the attack he expected, positioned reserves to exploit our anticipated retreat, and maintained strong central defenses in case the contradictory intelligence was designed to confuse him. When we actually attacked from the north with concentrated forces, his dispersed defenses couldn't provide effective resistance because he had spread his strength too thin, trying to counter every possible threat. Simultaneously, this victory taught me that there are three categories of information in any situation, each requiring different strategic handling to maintain control over outcomes. The first category includes information to share openly and completely: your capabilities, your principles, your past achievements, and your general intentions. When people know what you can do and what you stand for, they can predict your responses accurately and are less likely to test your limits unnecessarily. Open sharing of your strengths often prevents conflicts from occurring because potential opponents can calculate the costs of challenging you and usually decide that cooperation is more beneficial than confrontation. The second category includes information to conceal completely: your specific plans, your current weaknesses, your sources of intelligence, and your private concerns or doubts. The timing of revelations often matters more than the revelations themselves. Premature disclosure of detailed plans allows others to develop countermeasures before you can implement your strategies. Revelation of weaknesses invites exploitation by people who might not have discovered those vulnerabilities independently. Exposure of intelligence sources destroys your ability to gather information in the future. The third category, which requires the most sophisticated handling, includes information to distort strategically your real priorities, your actual timeline, your genuine concerns, and your true assessment of various people and situations. Sometimes appearing stronger than you actually are deters opposition and creates negotiating advantages. Sometimes appearing weaker than you really are lures opponents into overconfidence and tactical mistakes. Sometimes appearing to want something different from your real objective creates opportunities to achieve your actual goals, while others focus on defending against threats that don't exist. I once ended a siege without fighting by carefully managing information about our supplies and potential reinforcements. Through strategic leaks and controlled rumors, I convinced the enemy that we had enough resources to maintain the siege indefinitely, while they believed we knew exactly how little food and water remained in their city. They surrendered when they thought we could outlast them by months, not knowing that we actually had only 3 days of supplies remaining, and were desperately hoping they would negotiate before we were forced to retreat. The key principle underlying all information control is understanding that people make decisions based on what they believe to be true, not on what is actually true. If you can influence beliefs through strategic information management, you can influence decisions. If you can influence decisions, you can guide outcomes. Modern applications of this principle include controlling narratives in workplace conflicts, managing the timing of announcements to maximize their impact, and understanding that rumors and informal communications often spread faster and carry more credibility than official statements. Information flows like water. It seeks the path of least resistance and tends to pool in places where people gather to share knowledge and gossip. The person who understands these natural patterns and guides information flow strategically often has more influence than the person who originally possessed the information. I once released a caged bird to keep it loyal to me, and that paradox taught me the most sophisticated lesson about control. Sometimes gaining power requires releasing it. The bird I freed chose to return every evening because it wanted to, not because it had to. Choice creates stronger bonds than force ever could. This lesson became crucial when one of my most capable generals asked permission to leave my service and return to his home province. His father was dying, his family needed him, and he felt torn between duty to me and duty to his blood relatives. My advisors urged me to refuse his request. We were in the middle of important campaigns and couldn't afford to lose his skills. Instead, I not only granted his request, but provided him with an honor guard for his journey and resources to help settle his family's affairs. I told him, a general who abandons his family for ambition will eventually abandon his commander for the same reason. Go with my blessing, and know that you will always have a place in my service if you choose to return. He was gone for 8 months. During that time, he could have joined any number of rival commanders who offered him better positions and higher pay, but when his family obligations were settled, he returned to my service voluntarily and brought with him 3 other skilled officers who had been impressed by how I had treated him. That experience taught me to distinguish between essential control and meaningless control. Essential control involves things that directly affect your ability to achieve important goals. Meaningless control involves things that feel important but don't actually impact outcomes. Many leaders exhaust themselves trying to control every detail of how people work, when they work, where they work, and exactly how tasks are performed. This micromanagement often destroys the very results they're trying to create. Skilled people resist excessive oversight. Creative people become mechanical under rigid supervision, and motivated people lose initiative when every decision requires approval. The paradox is that giving people freedom within clear boundaries often produces better results than detailed control over every action. When people feel ownership of their work and autonomy in their methods, they become more invested in successful outcomes. I learned to set clear expectations about results while allowing flexibility in methods. I would tell my officers what needed to be accomplished and by when, but rarely dictated exactly how they should accomplish it. This approach revealed who had good judgment and who needed more guidance, while allowing capable people to excel beyond what I could have directed them to achieve. The psychology of ownership is powerful. People fight harder to protect something they feel they chose than something that was imposed on them. When you give people meaningful choices, they become emotionally invested in the outcomes of those choices. This principle applies to every relationship and situation. In families, children who feel heard and respected follow rules more willingly than children who feel controlled. In workplaces, employees who have input into decisions implement those decisions more effectively than employees who are simply told what to do. But letting go strategically requires wisdom about when to hold tight and when to hold loose. Hold tight to values, standards, and ultimate objectives. Hold loose to methods, timelines, and personal preferences. Hold tight to accountability for results. Hold loose to supervision of processes. The released bird returns because it wants to return. The controlled bird escapes the moment it finds an opportunity. True loyalty comes from choice, not compulsion. I keep a self-playing musical instrument in my study, a device that continues producing beautiful music long after the musician has left the room. It reminds me that the highest form of control is creating systems that work automatically without requiring your constant presence or intervention. Personal control is limited by time, energy, and attention. You can only be in one place, handle one crisis, influence one person at a time. But systematic control is unlimited good. Systems can operate continuously, handling multiple situations simultaneously, guiding behavior even when you're absent or focused elsewhere. I learned this principle during a campaign that required me to coordinate military operations across 3 different provinces, while maintaining political alliances at court and managing supply lines that stretched for hundreds of miles. Initially, I tried to personally oversee everything, approving every decision, reviewing every report, solving every problem as it arose. The result was chaos. While I was resolving supply issues in the Eastern Province, military discipline collapsed. In the Western Province, while I was managing political negotiations at court, bandits began raiding our supply convoys. While I was addressing the bandit problem, our allies started questioning whether I was capable of maintaining our agreements. I realized I needed to stop managing people and start managing systems. Instead of solving problems myself, I needed to create structures that would prevent problems from occurring or solve them automatically when they did arise. I began by establishing clear communication protocols. Instead of requiring all reports to come directly to me, I created a network where regional commanders reported to designated coordinators, who forwarded only critical information requiring my personal attention. This reduced my information overload, while ensuring important issues still reached me quickly. Next, I developed standard operating procedures for common situations. Instead of making individual decisions about supply requisitions, troop movements, and disciplinary actions, I created guidelines that allowed local commanders to handle routine matters independently, while escalating unusual situations to appropriate authorities. Most importantly, I built accountability into the structure itself rather than relying on personal relationships. Commanders knew they would be evaluated based on specific, measurable outcomes. Supply officers understood that waste or corruption would be detected through regular audits. Political liaison officers recognized that failed alliances would be traced back to their communication failures. The transformation was remarkable. Within 6 months, operations that had previously required my daily intervention were running smoothly without my involvement. Regional commanders were making good decisions independently. Supply lines operated efficiently. Political relationships remained stable. And I was free to focus on strategic planning rather than tactical firefighting. This principle applies to every area of life where you want lasting influence. In organizations, build systems that reward the behavior you want to see and make unwanted behavior difficult or costly. In families, establish routines and structures that support good habits rather than relying on daily reminders and enforcement. In personal life, design your environment so that healthy choices become easy choices. Instead of relying on willpower to exercise regularly, create systems that make exercise convenient and enjoyable. Instead of depending on motivation to eat well, structure your kitchen and schedule to support good nutrition automatically. The key is understanding that systems thinking beats willpower every time. Willpower is finite and inconsistent. You are motivated some days and tired other days, focused some hours and distracted other hours. But good systems work regardless of your mood, energy level, or attention span. Systems also scale beyond personal capacity. A good leader might be able to directly influence 50 people effectively, but a leader who builds systems can influence thousands of people through structures that embed their values, priorities, and decision-making principles into everyday operations. The ultimate goal is creating what I call invisible leadership. influence, that works through systems rather than personal intervention. When your principles are built into processes, when your standards are embedded in structures, when your vision guides decisions even in your absence, you have achieved the highest form of control. Remember, manage people directly, and your influence is limited by your presence. Manage through systems, and your influence becomes unlimited by your absence. On my desk sits an ancient stone inscription that will outlast empires, armies, and the memory of kings. It reminds me that the highest form of control is teaching others to control themselves, creating influence that extends far beyond your own lifetime. True power isn't measured by what you can make people do, it's measured by what they choose to do long after you're gone. As I reflect on decades of warfare, politics, and leadership, I realize that my greatest victories weren't the battles I won or the territories I conquered. They were the minds I shaped, the principles I passed on, and the leaders I helped create. Temporary dominance ends when you die, but lasting influence grows stronger with each generation that applies your teachings. I think of the young officers who served under me and went on to become great commanders themselves. They didn't succeed by copying my specific tactics. They succeeded by understanding the principles behind those tactics and adapting them to their own situations. When they faced challenges I had never encountered, they asked not, "What would Sun Tzu do?" but "What would Sun Tzu's principles suggest in this situation?" This is the difference between temporary dominance and lasting influence. Dominance requires your constant presence and active enforcement. Influence becomes self-sustaining when others internalize your wisdom and make it their own. The greatest leaders make more leaders, not more followers. Followers depend on your continued guidance and direction. Leaders think for themselves, solve their own problems, and extend your influence into areas you could never reach personally. When you teach someone to control situations themselves, you multiply your own power rather than just exercising it. But with this capability comes responsibility. The ability to shape minds and influence behavior is too powerful to use carelessly or selfishly. I learned that the principles I'm sharing with you can be used to help people or to harm them, to build trust or to manipulate it, to create mutual benefit or to exploit others' weaknesses. The ethics of influence matter because your reputation determines whether people trust you with power in the first place. If people believe you use these skills to serve your interests at their expense, they'll resist your influence and warn others about you. If they believe you use these skills to create mutual benefit and solve shared problems, they'll seek your guidance and recommend you to others. I measure the success of my teachings not by how much control they give you over others, but by how much control they give you over yourself and your circumstances. The person who masters these principles should need to use them less and less over time, because their reputation for wisdom and fairness makes others naturally cooperative. The ultimate paradox I've discovered is that masters of control rarely need to exercise it. When people trust your judgment, they ask for your advice rather than resist your suggestions. When they respect your capabilities, they avoid unnecessary conflicts with you. When they value your fairness, they come to you for resolution of their disputes with others. My final advice for becoming someone others trust with power is this: use these principles to solve problems, not to create them. Use them to build relationships, not to manipulate them. Use them to serve purposes larger than yourself, not just to serve your own ambitions. The responsibility that comes with understanding human nature and situational control is the responsibility to use that understanding wisely. The teacher who corrupts students destroys their own legacy. The leader who betrays followers loses the foundation of their own power. As you apply what I've shared, Remember that true success in controlling situations is measured by how little you need to control them. When your presence brings calm to chaos, when your involvement transforms conflicts into collaboration, when your guidance helps others succeed beyond what they thought possible, then you have achieved something far greater than mere dominance. You have created the kind of influence that outlasts empires and inspires generations. The stone inscription endures not because it was carved by force, but because it contains wisdom worth preserving. Make your influence worthy of preservation.